So now we can start the Q&A. Please raise your hand, identify yourself. Felipe Haistug. Tell you are the former president of Petrobras.
Well, you can imagine how much troubling and bustling in my head going through all the things that you presented. But it's so wide. First, I would say that Brazil, you could write 10 books about Brazil rather than 10 books about cross countries, because you have enough material here. But I was a little bit thinking, one comment on your on the question of the nomenclature, the name of the corruption, and just as an anecdote, here we call it malfeitos recently. So we don't like to talk about corruption, but people talk about misdoings.
I see.
Yes, but this brings me to a question, which is, I agree with you that all these programs or micro programs of reforms on the structure of the efficiency of the state in its providing its services and procurement and everything, absolutely necessary, and this is a process of civilization, I would say. But I was, just as a provocation to you, maybe, how can you, I was imagining, should we, suppose that we apply all these things in Brazil, and we've been applying them. I don't believe that 95% of the public sector is corrupt. 95% are honest people. And there's been, throughout the history of Brazil, a lot of reformists, and intelligent reformists, and trying to apply all these concepts throughout the development of the Brazilian public sector and the state. However, we are still in a sea of corruption or misdoings as well. So how can you actually isolate all these micro programs and the reformist programs that are good for all the countries, and you mentioned that, to the situation, for instance, that we live in Brazil? And then I cannot avoid thinking about your Argentinian colleague talking about culture. And you didn't mention that, but I think another vector which is important is the political system and that the way that the electoral system is financed. So if you avoid these two issues, I think it's very difficult to understand corruption in a kind of a more wider scale in Brazil. And we come, culturally speaking, we don't come from smugglers. There's been a lot in Brazil, but we're coming from a cartorial system in which there is a strong culture. But then you could say that Chile and Uruguay come also from a cartorial system, and our level of corruption there is much, much lower than ours, for instance, on one side. So this is not enough. So, well, this is just a provocation of how to tackle the issue.
Sure.
Can you hold on your answer so that we can collect two?
All right.
Okay, there will be time for everybody. So first, Alberto, then we come here in the first row. I should have added that Felipe was president of Petrobras many, many years ago.
When everything was wonderful, yeah.
So actually my question, it's in line of Felipe's question. It seems that Brazilian political and economic class agreed, a tacit agreement after the Constitution of '88, that to be corrupt, it's when you, at least in the financing of campaigns, political campaigns, is when you get the money and put it in your pockets. However, if this money, that's also a result of corruption, is only channeled to finance campaigns, that's not corruption, morally. And it seems that it was morally accepted by all the actors. However, we had an exogenous shock, that's called Lava Jato operation, where the Justice Department start to investigate and say, okay, I don't care if you put your money in our pockets or not, all this money is corruption. And that's what you are seeing now, and as a society, I think you realize it over the last week, you're like, okay, what's going on? What's the next steps? How are we going to deal with it? Because at the sense, it's very endogenous in our economy, in our political system. So my question is, have you ever seen something like that in other country? For this situation, would you have some concrete suggestions how you move forward our current situation? Thank you.
Go. So, the last one of the first round. Okay, I'll be back to you. I have one here, you there. Okay, and you here. Okay.
Maria Cibele Santos, in line with the two previous questions, what is the place of education in all of this? Because for sure, culture we can change, but to change it, we need to educate our children, I believe, from bottom to top.
Thank
Okay.
you. So, enough food for thoughts here.
Okay,
Then
yes.
we go for a second round.
All right.
If
all
you
right,
don't mind.
yes, of course. All right. So, important questions that all of you are asking. I'll just start with yours briefly. I mean, education is an important part of it, but to me, it's a necessary but not sufficient story, right? So you could, I mean, there were discussions in Mexico that were similar to this, that what we have to do, the real thing is we have to get into elementary education, we have to get to the kids when they're little and change their attitudes, right? Okay, but if you just do that, they're going to grow up and they're going to be suckers, right? I mean, that's terrible. You know, you've got to, there has to be some change in the way in which the system is working so that they can, or they have to, that is either the way in which the ordinary system is working and the possibility of people who have been educated to be honest and to want honesty in others, to have places where they can safely complain about stuff, right? Where they can make a complaint and feel that it's not just going to go into a black hole. I was in a city in Italy that had on the side of the city hall, there was a face with a big mouth. Have you ever seen this? And you could, if you wanted to denounce something or say something was wrong, you could speak into this mouth, you know, and they, supposedly someone is listening on the other side. But, you know, who knows, right? So there's so there has to be some credibility that you're not just trying to make good little kids, but that there's something happening. Now, I think you have raised the questions of the political system and campaign financing, and certainly the financing of political campaigns is one of those sort of complicated gray areas. Different countries have different campaigns have to be financed. If they're not going to be financed by the government, they're going to be financed privately in some ways, and so getting the laws with respect to campaign finance straight and clear is important. As I understand it, it's not so obvious that business contributions to political campaigns are okay, right? I mean, it's first of all, there's a question of the obvious temptation when this happens of especially if it's not public and not widely discussed and open, taking some for yourself, right? Either you, the politician, take some for yourself, or some of these things may be operated through third parties. There's some Italian examples of that, of the business saying, well, I gave all that money, it was supposed to go to that party, and the person who was the middle person, you know, put a lot of it in Switzerland somewhere. So campaign finance needs to be transparent, and it needs to be not just the guys who are doing it and the guys who are receiving it saying, oh yeah, that's just the way we do things. You know, that's just okay. We all do it. We all understand that's the way we do it. But that has to be something that the citizens have accepted as a valid way of financing campaigns. And of course, there's a question of what the letter of the law says. I can't tell you about that. That's for you and the prosecutors to deal with. But certainly the impression that I get from at least journalism and from talking to people is that that form of campaign financing is not like kind of broadly acceptable. Oh, that's just okay for people to do that. Now, of course, there is a special problem here of how do you govern in Brazil when you have a presidential system independently elected president, having to deal with a Congress with how many parties? 30?
20 waiting and growing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Large numbers of parties. Some are more important than others. So there's some that apparently, almost always matter in that sense. So the president is going to be governing through a coalition, any president, through having to get through a coalition. And as I understand it, those coalitions are pretty fragile. People change parties. They may be paid to change parties. I don't know, but they change parties pretty easily after they've gotten elected. So there's a structural problem here, which doesn't excuse the payoffs, right? It doesn't make it okay that it's happening. But it is something that I think needs to be part of the discussion here. And I understand. A lot of people are. I'm not saying anything new here, but it is a difficulty. I did a study a number of years ago with a former student looking across countries at the relationship between constitutional structures and overall levels of corruption. And what we found was that a particular risky situation was to have a presidential system combined with proportional representation for the legislature. A case in which Brazil...
Which is exactly the case in Brazil.
Right?
Yeah.
And part of the problem was that it gave the political party heads sort of like too much power. It was
And we have proportional representation in steroids, right?
Yeah,
So
really, yeah.
28 parties. Right?
Yeah. So it's and many of these parties being kind of not standing for a set of ideas very much. And it's hard for voters to have to hold to account public officials. So there is something a deep structural issue, and I don't have an answer to what I can point out to the structural problem. What any kind of response, what's feasible in the current situation. But then, of course, you still are faced with the question of how to finance political campaigns. I gather you do have quite a lot of public money in campaigns already, partly related to television time, although that may be set up to some extent favor the incumbent parties more than you might like. But I'm a little skeptical of how this current ban on corporate contributions is going to work, because obviously that's an attempt to democratize the campaign financing. But I worry, as a longtime student of corruption, that this is something that may push more of this stuff underground, make it even harder to hold people to account for where they've gotten their money from. So that it implies that if you're going to really carry out that stricture, you've got to have some really good monitoring on where the money comes from. There have been some suggestions, one made by my husband, who's also a professor, of something called vouchers. In other words, public financing, but where the money goes to each individual person gets a voucher, that rich and poor, everybody, that they can spend how they want on political campaigns. That costs the government money, right? I mean, it's the city of Seattle is going to do this. We'll see how it works. But it's
people in Brazil will create a secondary market to exchange the vouchers. Yeah.
Well, but to some extent, you see, part of the point is that a secondary market is okay, right? In other words, you could give your voucher to Greenpeace. You could give your voucher to a labor rights organization, right? You'd give it straightforwardly, that because you believe in the issues that they are going to support and in their kind of expertise. But in any case, it's certainly right to raise this as a piece of the story. But I want to resist the claim that just because everybody's been doing it for a long time, it must be okay, right? I mean, because it doesn't seem like that, right? It doesn't seem like that's the public response to this information. So, we're going to.
Good. Next round, I'll try to. Okay, you're driving me crazy here. So we can start from there, from my left to the right. Okay. Wait a second. Would you please try to make your questions
Yes.
shorter so that...
Sure, sure. First, thank you for your enlightening speech. My name is Aline Menezes. I'm a lawyer, so I apologize in advance in case my question seems to you too legalistic, but no one is perfect. And one of the trends that we have been watching here in Brazil is imposing through the legislation is strict liability on market participants throughout the service provider value chain. So did you see in your research at other benchmarks, or have you ever thought about this as a legitimate strategy in terms of fighting corruption? The way I see, and I can give you my opinion already, is that it may scare serious people off of business because it's a strict liability. No one really questions whether you played any role in connection with that subject. And actually, you can even attract people that are partners from corruption instead of the other way around. So that's it.
Good. So now here.
Good morning. My name is Shirley. I'm the legal director of FISA Brazil, but I'm here representing American Chamber. I just wanted to get your perspective about how can the sector industry associations and any other associations could be more collaborative among them in order to support this movement of change in terms of corruption. We see that the sectors, associations, usually they have a code of conduct, but it does not encompass corruption in general terms. So I just want to see your perspective, how, if you had any experience in US that could be also useful for us. Thank you.
Now, I think we should move back to the line. So Claudio, former director of Transparency Brazil.
Okay, Claudio Weber Abramo. I was, as Sergio said, I direct Transparency Brazil, which is an anti-corruption organization for about 15 years. And so I would like to make 2 or 3 small observations about your speech. And most things you say about how is it that public procurement should work are in place in Brazil. Okay, there are some difficulties in pushing attitudes, especially in the academic sector. For instance, creating indicators to examine the outputs of the procurement system is very hard because, as you probably observed, there's a lot of macroeconomics around, but not too many microeconomists. People dislike indicators. It's very hard to make people look at them at the stage too. We created several indicators, for instance, of the type you worked with in Nigeria, right? It was very hard to make people understand what was going on with those numbers. As for the Hungarian study you mentioned, I read it in working paper form. It's not applicable in Brazil because of the size. Brazilian size is too big for that. You must be not that methodology. I doubt it very much it would work in Brazil. In any case, Sergio is telling me to be short. In the present crisis in Brazil, which is in the mind of everybody, there's a lot of lawyers going around speaking things, especially public prosecutors who like to punish people. And there's too little thinking about causes. What is causing, what caused, in this causing, what happened in Petrobras and around the public procurement systems in big projects. Nobody's thinking about that. And blaming the political financing will not work, as you said. Prohibiting political financing from firms will simply put everything below the rug. There is a system of appointing people to occupy public positions in Brazil, which is, in my mind,
central for the corruption structures in Brazil. Because public officials are not public officials, they are political officials, political representatives.
Good. Can
Thank
you
you.
digest one more question, and then we go for oh, okay, go ahead. Okay. So
Oh,
you
I
can
forgot.
answer them. No, I was asking
Okay.
you whether
Okay.
we can take a fourth question in this round.
It's-
Or
it's
would
up
it be
to me.
too much?
No, it's
Okay.
all right. I don't
So
know. I can pick and choose.
one
here.
more.
Hi, thanks for coming. Sandra Bernardo, Forensic and Investigation Director at Grant Thornton. If you had an opportunity, which kind of advice you would give for Sérgio Moro, who is the Lava Jato Task Force Chief Officer?
Well, I wouldn't presume to give him advice. It seems to me that he's doing a good job. I mean, it's obviously going to be controversial, but there is a problem that needs to be dealt with and thought about. And the hope is that by publicizing some of the things that are happening, that feeds back into the way the corporate community discusses or understands what's acceptable. Right? So as you're saying, there's this kind of culture issue, right? And culture should not, for me, and whoever was talking about this before, should not be taken as this frozen thing that can't ever change. One of you was asking about, you from the American, person from the American Chamber, and about what has happened. Partly, I think it's as a result of the OECD treaty, which I think Brazil has signed on to, which is a treaty that requires any country who's ratified it to make an offense for their companies to pay bribes to get business abroad. So it doesn't apply to domestic corruption, but it applies to overseas corruption. Now, Brazil's probably in this kind of intermediate stage where there are a number of international firms that are signing contracts in Brazil, as well as some Brazil multinationals that are operating abroad. So the treaty would apply to the Brazilian companies operating abroad, and also to probably most of the companies that are investing in Brazil in their home country. So that's covering a kind of a bunch of the corruption that's occurring, and I think it has had an impact on the internal organization of large multinationals that are engaged in business, across borders. Because as you probably know, the most aggressive enforcers of that treaty, building on the American experience of the 1977 Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is really the underlying basis for the OECD treaty, the U.S. government has been the most aggressive of anybody in bringing cases under that treaty and under the U.S. statutes, which can hold under U.S. law can hold not just individuals criminally liable, but the corporations themselves are criminally responsible. And corporations don't like that. You can't put the corporations in jail, of course. I mean, there's always this debate: can corporations commit crimes? Well, U.S. is quite pragmatic about that. Right? I mean, they don't say that there's some kind of philosophical problem with an organization being criminally liable. Yeah, they did something that was criminal. Call them criminals if that's useful, and they can get named and shamed and penalized through fines. Well, what's the result has been, partly what you were suggesting, is a focus on the internal organization of the corporation, so that there is some credible claim by the boards of directors and the corporate leaders that they have actually, in good faith, tried to reduce corruption at the lower levels or the contracting levels of the firm, and gives them some of that monitoring responsibility, right, of what's happening lower level. They can't excuse this by saying, oh, that's just the way we do things here, right? If they are violating the corruption laws in the countries where they're operating. So I think that has led to quite a bit of work at the corporate level to redesign their internal operations. And this seems to me something that ought to carry over into the large corporations that are entirely Brazilian corporations, or that do most of their work inside Brazil. And also that if they do international work, where they have this vulnerability possibly, that they shouldn't just kind of insulate the checking to their international business. Should be applying to what they're doing inside the country. And I think there has been a kind of a change in culture in the multinational business community to be, that is partly, of course, a response. We don't want to get caught, but it's also a real change in the idea of what is it acceptable for a firm to do when it's seeking government contracts or government benefits, concessions, privatizations of one kind or another. Now, I think the only worry here is that there is being developed a kind of a list of best practices. Here's what you should be doing. And some of those are pretty obvious. Certain kinds of monitoring things are pretty obvious. I think we should have more research on the relationship between the things on the list of practices and its relationship to corruption. We don't have very strong kind of empirical connections here, but that I think doesn't go against the idea of trying to come up with behavior that is credible, that isn't just kind of paper stuff. Now, I'm not sure I understood about what you meant by strict liability on market producers. Is that something like, you mean something there about like corporate liability for?
More or less goes maybe on the individuals as well. They're just liable. They don't question the specific role of the person. They do not investigate if there was any gross negligence or willful misconduct. It's just strictly liable.
If they did what?
Questions, period.
But if they did what? They had to do something.
That's my point, actually. Just by procuring to have government contracts, in case the company itself gets caught,
Okay.
the person who participated in the provision of the service, regardless of the actual role of this person, is deemed to be liable.
Well, but it would seem, I can't, this is probably too much Brazilian law for me to really answer. But it is a, because the strict liability could be on the corporation itself, right? And then a responsibility on the corporation to discipline their own employees. So I can't really, I mean, I can see where there can be a problem that somebody thinks they were just following their rules, but there is could be a question of, well, I think one thing that's being discussed here in Brazil is the possibility of a law protecting whistleblowers, which you don't have. Everybody know what a whistleblower is? Apparently, I would think with all your soccer madness you know what it was. But okay, it is the American English term is often used, right? Somebody who is inside an organization and sees something going wrong and blows the whistle to either to hire somebody else higher up in the corporation or eventually to the government, right? And that's the whistleblower would come to the government, and that they're protected, their jobs are protected, and in the private sector in the U.S. they can get a lot of money if they ends up being if the malfeasance ends up losing the government money, and there's a settlement in which the corporation is paying the government for malfeasance of one kind or another. Some share of that comes to the person who blew the whistle. Right? So that's a kind of a.
So besides protection, there is a monetary incentive for the whistleblower.
Yes, big monetary incentive. It can be like 5-10% of the settlement. Not for civil servants. This is for a private person inside I mean, I had a case actually, a woman who came and talked to my class who worked for Pfizer, and she was an inspector, and she had seen malfeasance in the production of drugs. It wasn't corruption, but she just seen bad practices. And she initially reported to her own boss and said, there's a problem here, and they fired her. And then she went to finally, she tried, she loved the company, she really wanted to say something. She finally went to, and the government was involved here because this only applies to firms that have business with government. The drugs were being sold to people through Medicare and Medicaid, so there was that connection. And it took years and years. This is, if you want to be a whistleblower, you've got to be tough. And she had a lawyer who was doing it on a contingent fee basis, so he was making part of the gain. She finally ended up getting several $1 million for doing this, right? Now it had to be proved, right? It wasn't just you don't just get it, for the fun of it, and the firm is going to push back a lot. So that's kind of the flip side of liability, that you are trying to build into the incentives facing employees something over and above their own incentives within their own organization. That applies to civil servants too. Some credible way of complaining about something that is not going to that is going to at least counteract the kind of negative things that could happen, like in this case being fired or being transferred if you're a civil servant somewhere real far away that you don't like, that kind of kind of thing. Maybe just find it. I mean, you had sort of a lot about procurement. I'm not quite understanding why indicators are hard. We could talk about it maybe later afterwards. I think that there is this problem here of the relationship between public law and private law that comes out when private firms are dealing with government. Right? And the private firms want to say all the laws having to do with secrecy of private firms, all of those should be applying even though we're dealing with government. Right? And my view is that that's wrong. Right? I mean, that maybe that needs to be, not that they all should be gotten rid of, but that when you are contracting with government, you are taking on some kind of aspects of public responsibility and public interest, and that there is a public responsibility to clarify what it is you're doing, to be more transparent about those kinds of contracts than the ordinary sorts of contracts. And that maybe, I think that's an issue in the U.S. too, but it may be something that needs to be thought about further. So I haven't solved all your problems, but hopefully have some things to think about. So thank you.
Do we still have time for two
good.
more questions?
All right.
Okay. Please, this man first, because he was waiting for a long time.
Okay. My name is Artur Badin. I am the General Counsel for Camargo Correia, former head of the Brazilian Antitrust Authority. And I had the opportunity to implement the leniency program in Brazil in 2003. Corruption can be seen as a natural market remedy for transaction costs related to the lack of trust among parties. Both parties are subject to moral hazard and opportunism in relational contracts such as construction. Corruption brings trust from a kind of omertà perspective. Due to this, both parties can rely on each other. In Lava Jato case, is that exactly what happened? Conspiracy among public agents and contractors pursuing timely construction of oil platforms. Besides all that Professor Ackerman exposed, I think that in the root of corruption is also the lack of effective and timely enforcement of contracts, either by administrative and judicial entities. Criminal law takes corruption as a legal transaction contract. In exchange of bribe, the public agent gives an administrative decision according to the private agent interest. However, Lava Jato proved to be something much more sophisticated. Instead of qui pro quo or spot transaction, we have relational corruption. Private agents paid bribes in order to assure good relation with public agents, not necessarily related to this or that action. It's, in one word, institutionalized corruption. How to deal with it?
One last question.
Okay.
Roberto.
Thank you, Sergio. My name is Robert Wong. Great presentation, Professor Ackerman. I just want to be very blunt about it. You know, we talk a lot about reforms, cutting bureaucracy, reducing incentives, increasing costs. These are good, and they will probably help treat the symptoms. But no, I didn't hear the word greed. To me, that is the underlying main cause of all corruptions. At all sectors, all levels, like there's corruption in companies, in government, in hospitals, even in the church. There's goddamn corruption. So my question is, how do we deal with greed, which is a capital sin, which is part of human nature? I think that will be something that might help.
Very easy question. The last, but the easiest question. You can resort to the Pope if you want.
No, thank you. Yeah. No, I mean, you know, I come to this whole topic out of a background in economics, so I come out of what I'm most comfortable with is kind of taking people as you find them and thinking about creating institutional structures within which they operate, in which their instincts for greed and personal advancement are constrained or not rewarded as much as they would otherwise, and yet their sort of self-interest is channeled in productive directions. Greed is a kind of nasty word for self-interest. I mean, it's kind of getting out of hand, and that's really why I've tried to focus over the years in ways to kind of channel self-interest in productive ways, which isn't to say there can't be changes over time, as we were talking about, corporate the idea of what it takes to be a responsible corporation in the modern world is both a story about now this is part of what making a profit means, because there might be consequences, and it's also about changes in the attitudes of the people in top management about how they want to be viewed themselves, going forward. But let me come to your question, which is an interesting one, important one, that the part of what we're seeing in Brazil, as it's true as other places too, is a kind of long, ongoing interactive trust relationship, establish good relationships, kind of going forward, and so that if the law requires there to be a very explicit quid pro quo, you're not going to get it. And in fact, partly if the law requires that actually gives a big incentive to work through these kind of vague things. It sort of gives you a kind of deniability about what's going on. I think that's a reason why the law should treat certain kinds of behavior as per se illegal. Right? You can just worry about whether it should be corrupt or civil, some kind of offense, but that you make the kind of story that you're taking, which says, look, there's a system here, and it's the whole systemic thing that's the problem, right? What's happened is a build-up of kind of interpersonal or interinstitutional trusting relationships that favor both sides at the expense of the public interest, and that it should be sufficient for law enforcement to identify that there have been payoffs made, right? And that it shouldn't be up to them to have to show, like, specifically what happened, that you can see as a systemic matter what happened. And that seems to me to be a much more focused form of law enforcement that can try to get at this. Because there is this problem. People think of trust as a good thing. We have a nice trusting relationship, that's great. I have trusting relationships with all my friends, that's really nice. But when you're doing something outside the law, particularly this kind of organizational offenses, trust is the only thing you've got with the guys on the other side, right? And so trust is operating against the public interest rather than for it. There's a nice book by Diego Gambetta called The Sicilian Mafia. Now, I don't want to be equating Brazil with the Sicilian Mafia, but he makes the important point about how these kind of entrenched systems there were based on very strong trusting relationships, sometimes, of course, backed up by threats. Right? And I'm sure that's true here, even if we're not talking about people getting killed, I hope. Right, but we're talking about blackmail of various kinds can be part of these relationships. So I think that you're right that these kind of long-term, rather vague, on purpose vague situations are, I think, better dealt with by certain kinds of per se rules, and then we can worry about what the punishment should be. But that's important, and it seems, at least from what little I know about your situation, that's an important piece of the story. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Susan, for this wonderful, wonderful presentation. A very pleasant and productive morning. I hope you can come back soon.
Okay.
Okay, thank
Thank
you.
you.